For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 2, Episode 37 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami starts now.
Today on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
And so there is a draw the lines, connect the dots between NASH resolution and improvement in outcomes. It's pretty clear. The additional part of this is we have drugs being studied that have pleiotropic effects beyond histopathology. These medications can improve glycemic control, which is also linked to an outcome. We have drugs that can improve atherogenic lipids, again linked to an outcome. Drugs that can induce weight loss.
We do have good evidence now to show that fibrosis as sort of an intermediate endpoint is important, and improvements in fibrosis do link to hard endpoints. But quantifying fibrosis and actually diagnosing fibrosis is challenging, and it's not easy like drawing a lipid panel is and saying your total cholesterol is over 200.
And just my quick thought on what I heard from Michelle, Louise, and Stephen is we're not going to be treating everybody who has fatty liver on ultrasound. I think this is a very important message, and it's not like in the cholesterol field where everybody jumped on the elevated cholesterol.
If you're treating a set of numbers, then I'll just hit every number separately. I'll do something cheap and I'll be done. If I'm treating the system, I have to think about it a little differently. So that puts some pressure on us, going back to kind of where I started, which is to explain why certain patients with fatty liver have risks that aren't simply about reversing fibrosis.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Dr. Stephen Harrison, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guests, hepatology researchers and key opinion leaders Professor Jörn Schattenberg and Dr. Michelle Long, as they discuss how the early statin market will differ from the early NASH market. This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Hi, this is Roger. And to kick off, let me say it's great to be back. We did not have an episode last week. I'll talk about that on the back end. And this week is the episode that we recorded on July 6th. Just to let you know, next week we will have Donna Cryer and a band of patient advocates taking over the podcast and doing something exciting and different. I'll be back in 2 weeks. This is a fantastic episode, great topic, a lot of really interesting points. I hope you enjoy listening half as much as we enjoyed making it. Listen in and I'll see you on the back end. Bye-bye now. I feel I should tell the audience that this is different than the other episodes that you've experienced, in that we are recording this on July 6th and you're not going to hear it for 2 weeks. This is part of a pattern of what we intend to do with the podcast, that we intend to have an 8 or a 9 day period in general between when we record and when we release. That will give us more time for editing and to get other commentary and really, I think, make a richer podcast, or to make the 5 or 6 days that we release all our material a richer experience. What it does mean, however, is that by the time you hear this, we will know who won Euro 2020, if you're a football fan. And while Jörn and Louise and I were commenting on who we thought might win and why before the podcast, as of today, we don't know. We may have fun letting Louise act like England's won and make that her personal icebreaker and see what happens with that. But we won't know. So you'll lose a little bit of that spontaneity sometimes around current events, but I think it will get you much better content up for the rest of the podcast. So today we have with us Jörn Schattenberg. Hey, Jörn, how are you today?
Thanks, Roger. I'm fine. And I guess the one statement I can make, Germany is not going to make the final on this European Championship, having lost to the English team. Congratulations, Louise.
Thank you. It's been a long time coming. That's all I can say. We've tried and tried.
And Jörn, I will make one catty statement, which was that when Muller missed that perfect setter that would have taken the match to 1-1, after Sterling scored this goal, I didn't think a British person would score in a knockout match. I said to myself, oh my gosh, they've changed sides.
Things happen.
England's playing like Germany, Germany's playing like England. So let's hope that England continues to be successful. And that Germany rebounds brilliantly under whoever the new national coach will be. And then we have Michelle Long with us. Hey, Michelle, glad to have you with us today.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for having me back.
Our pleasure. And we expect to have Stephen dropping in at some point during the podcast. I say that casually, but I believe that he thought he was accepting in Central Time, and we all accepted in East Coast Time, which means we're an hour off, and he's here now. So timing is everything. Hey, Stephen, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. Hey, guys.
So, Stephen, I was just explaining to the audience as we get started that while this is July 6th, we're not going to drop this episode for 15 days. So we're going to lose a little bit on current events, but we're going to be able to have a lot more time to edit and get comments from other parties and I think make for richer overall content.
Okay, good.
So with that, why don't we get started? Classic icebreaker. One good thing that's happened in your life in the last week, I would just caution the panelists that if you talk about something that's a current events thing, people might catch up or they might not. Although, Louise, as you know, we've given you dispensation to act like England's won the Euros if that's what you choose to do. Okay, brave one, go first.
Let me get started here. And I think I'm going to mention a personal one first. I'm very excited about the summer month and actually some vacation, being able to leave home again with the family. We're planning a short trip to the sea, and I'm really looking forward to that. Have the kids and be outside of the area that I haven't left for such a long time. Professionally, I think very exciting that we get more cirrhosis studies going in my center. I think Europe has been trailing a little bit. Sponsors are slower to adapt to us, but there's so many great trials coming. And I screened 2 patients with compensated cirrhosis from NASH this week, and I think that's a personal highlight for myself.
I'll go next then. From a personal aspect, it's going to be that I'm obviously going to be at the semi-final. So England versus Denmark, which is exciting for me. So I don't know how it's going to pan out, but may the best team win, but the atmosphere will be great. But from a professional highlight, it was probably just as we were finishing off EASL that we were happy to announce that we've now introduced fibre scanning and as part of all-round liver assessment in health and well-being for people being screened for CIFR risk, which means every single person going through the CIFR risk process, whether it's employers looking after their employees or people doing their own health and well-being checks or managing their health, will actually have FibroScan and all liver assessments added as routine to their packages. So that's certainly a first in the UK. So we're starting to get the wellness and lifestyle up, and people are really interested in knowing about their liver health. So that's an exciting part for Towers and Health and movement forward for members of the public and anybody to get full comprehensive screening, including FibroScan and non-invasive tests.
That's great, Louise. That's fantastic. Michelle, go ahead.
Personally, I would say that Boston, we've had a little bit of a heat wave, but we, my family now are members at our community pool, and being able to go swimming after work just really washes all the stress away, and it's a really, really nice feeling. So that's something that I've been appreciating. And then professionally, I would say that at Boston University, we now have a number of clinical trials opening after having everything on the long pause with COVID, and we're screening, and we'll have another study opening in a week or so. So that's been really exciting. See things return to normal as the numbers have gotten so much better in the area.
Look, I'm just going to live vicariously off of Jörn and Michelle's professional highlights, because I like to hear that they're screening for NASH trials, both cirrhotic and non-cirrhotic. So that's tremendous. Let's see. For me, I would say just having spent the weekend with my family and extended family, it was great to be able to huddle together again after a prolonged period of being without them. Having my parents in town was great to see them as well. Professionally, the news important for the field and also personally is we announced completion of enough people to meet the Subpart H criteria for Madrigal's resmetirom Maestro NASH trial. So the proverbial clock has started ticking down, 52 weeks of treatment to the last patient crosses the finish line. And then, of course, begins the cleanup, the data mining, the presentation of the top line results, and hopefully enough to get one of the registrational endpoints met, and then filing the NDA and looking for approval. So again, just a milestone for the field, if you will.
Well, that's fantastic. And I know folks are hopeful to optimistic about the outcome of all this, I think with good reason. Would you call this the beginning of the last lap, Stephen?
Oh, I don't know if I'd call it that. I just think it's, we need some good news stories in the field to continue to propel this disease space forward. And we're long in the tooth on needing some great news. So we need that first drug to get across the finish line. I really don't care which one it is. We just need one to get there so that people will realize that there is an approvable pathway that can be met, can be achieved. Drugs can be approved for this disease. And I think once we break the seal, so to speak, on that, then others will follow suit. Combination therapies will begin to happen at a much faster pace, and everybody will be invigorated to build on that, to capitalize on where we need to go from that point. And I think there's a huge area still, we've talked about it on the podcast many times, disease state awareness. And I don't think we're ever going to get the disease state awareness, the marketing campaign that we need for this disease until we have an approvable drug. So that milestone is absolutely critical.
Couldn't agree more on that front. Absolutely. It is the approval of drugs that drives massive growth in disease state awareness all over the world because of how money gets spent on that. I couldn't agree
agree with that more. My personal highlight is that I limped back into Pennsylvania at about 4 o'clock this morning. That shouldn't be a highlight. It should be a low light, given that I was trying to leave 2 days ago at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But the first day, our flight out of Corpus Christi was late, and what they offered my wife was a red eye through Houston and Denver, arriving at 5 in the morning. We said nuts to that. The second thing they gave us was a flight we could go on together at 6 o'clock last night, arriving in Newark at midnight. That was 2.5 hours late. We had to drive an hour. So I'm now in Pennsylvania.
The good news, Roger, you got to always look at the lemonade, out of the lemons, right? Mm-hmm. So you were able to persevere through 48 hours, and you showed that you could still function at 4 in the morning.
Stephen, I showed that I could drive at 2:30 in the morning, having been on a plane for all those hours. Yeah, and frankly, my lemon out of lemonade is I get to look over the Delaware River and see the hills, and I love the place where I live. So, being home's a good thing. And if you have to work a little harder to get there, that doesn't stink either. My professional best is also a little bit different. By the time you hear this, audience, we will have been through 2 episodes where we didn't do the conventional thing. This is the 6th. What we'll be releasing this week will be summaries of conversations from earlier in the year, each of which is focused on a topic that we think is of interest. And then next week, because my original plan was to go to Puerto Rico for a week electronics free, Donna Cryer is going to be filling in as a guest host and talking about clinical trials. The Puerto Rican trip got canceled because we were told there was too much COVID in eastern Puerto Rico for us to want to spend our time. There are too many restrictions. So we have alternate plans, but I will be electronics free next week when y'all are recording the session. And we'll look forward to listening to it as much as everyone else does. So with all that said, let's get on to today's podcast. One of the things I've personally experienced since the first talk I gave where I met Stephen back at NASH in 2019, and we heard it as recently as EASL, was the concern that payers and some public health people have that once there is a NASH drug, the demand and the patient load will swamp a market and that the economics are going to lack incentive. The example I'm given is statins, that when statins became available in the U.S. for the first time, that began a rush to a $25 billion a year drug market that paid off in somewhere between 10 and 20 years. Well, it didn't even pay off, but you saw benefit in a period between 10 and 20 years. And that cost the healthcare system a bunch of money. At that point in time, payers didn't have a lot of power to control, but they did now. And one of the concerns you hear from everybody now is what will payers do when drugs come to market? So I think it is helpful to begin a conversation on why what we see now with NASH and NASH drugs is so different than what we saw back in the mid-'80s with statins. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out 7 or 8 points of difference that I can see, and then, or 7 or 8 points about statins that I think are different, and then I'm going to ask the group each to take one and comment, and we'll go back and forth for a while and see what we land. All right, here's my list. First of all, the major event in bringing cholesterol forward, which happened about the time that Merck launched lovastatin, which was the first statin, was a very large study called LRC-CPPT, the last major study I've ever seen that didn't have an acronym for a name, $150 million from the FDA. And their conclusion was that every 1% drop in total cholesterol led to a 2% drop in coronary artery disease and coronary events. And by the way, at that point in time, they said that was true for everybody with a cholesterol over 200 milligrams per deciliter. So that's a third of the U.S. population or more. Everybody should be treated because you can decrease their risk. And what that did was it led to a really, over time, a widespread and extremely broad demand for these agents. In addition, everything you needed to know to be able to evaluate somebody's cholesterol was already on a standard heme panel. You got total cholesterol, you got HDL, you got LDL, you got triglycerides. The ratios you had to build weren't very complicated. So everything was there. The levels were too high because they were based on 95th percentile of the population. But one of the first things that public health did was lobby to drop the levels. So pretty soon, every time somebody looked at a test, they could see that their cholesterol level was elevated to the point of being dangerous. That was roughly a third of the population. There had been 25 years of debate about the meaning of cholesterol, which was put to bed by the LRC study, which was the definitive study. And there were products going into market just waiting for results that they could sell. When the study came out, the 2 pivotal related specialties, cardiologists and endocrinologists, both jumped on it with both feet and started using that to promote and discuss patients a lot more aggressively. And Big Pharma was involved in the early stage drugs. The first statin to come to market came from Merck. The second one came from Bristol Myers Squibb. The third one came from Merck and AstraZeneca. And although it wasn't, the fourth was from Novartis, and the sixth, which wound up really changing all the rules, came from Pfizer. So you had extensive Big Pharma investment, minimal insurer payer to stop the drug from coming, and not a lot of standards or understanding of disease that you could use to stratify patients and say, treat these folks first and those folks second. As a result, statins are widely adopted. As soon as anybody has anything that looks like an outcome study, it jumps from there. And the insurers, I think, still believe that the economics never worked in their favor. So now we have insurers who've got power. And one of the tasks is to help educate them and the various physician specialties and everybody else on the idea that there is stratified risk associated with NAFLD and NASH. Some patients are worth treating more than others. We've got cost-effectiveness studies. Miles talked about one of them here a couple of months ago, where we've demonstrated that today screening every diabetic patient for NASH is cost-effective, even in the absence of NASH drugs. That's what statins were. I think there's several points of difference. And I would just like to ask each of you, brave one going first, pick one element of what I just described where you want to talk about how NASH is different and why you think treatment should be given greater priority even in advance of drugs, and certainly as soon as drugs start to come to market.
Stephen, I'm going to give it a first thought and then see what Steve and Michelle and Louise are going to have to say follow-up. Obviously, I wasn't around the 80s to follow all that discussion for too close, but I think the major difference is that we have dealt with the biomarkers that are closely linked to the pathophysiology of the disease, indicating disease progression, potentially rapid progression, to a much deeper extent. And the understanding of which biomarkers link to which outcome that has been defined as provable and relevant to the patient is just much more evolved from my perspective and understanding. And looking at the bigger field, I think we'll have patients we're worried about as hepatologists and want to treat them to prevent cirrhosis or even reverse cirrhosis potentially in the future. And these patients might need aggressive treatment. And then there's the subset, which is probably the majority of patients, that has some steatohepatitis that's progressing or stable or slowly progressing, and it contributes to worsening of the metabolic control. And as a hepatologist, I might highlight that there's a drug that's anti-steatohepatitis, working against hepatosteatohepatitis. This patient is not going to reach a liver endpoint soon, but by adding this drug, you will get a better glycemic control. And so I think in one smaller subset, we're going to be the main person to be thinking about which drug to prevent cirrhosis or progression or reverse. And then on the other hand, we're just going to be partner of the cardiologist or diabetologist. And I think all of this is going to be based on well-defined biomarkers.
Yeah, Jörn, I think you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, we're a lot further along than where the lipid field was at the time of the first drug crossing the finish line and getting approved. But also remember, not only do we have data linking fibrosis progression to outcomes, we now have data linking fibrosis regression to improved outcomes. We also know from bariatric surgery data and from elafibranor data and other data sets that improvement in the NAFLD activity score is linked to improvement in fibrosis. And so there is a draw the lines, connect the dots between NASH resolution and improvement in outcomes. But I think it's pretty clear. The additional part of this is we have drugs being studied that have pleiotropic effects beyond histopathology. These medications can improve glycemic control, which is also linked to an outcome. We have drugs that can improve atherogenic lipids, again, linked to an outcome. Drugs that can induce weight loss, linked to an outcome. So obviously, we think the ideal NASH drug for the majority of patients is likely going to be combination therapy that will allow us to hit on all of those facets collectively. However, our drugs that are in late phase development now are, generally speaking, targeting multiple different avenues of disease and multiple comorbidities. So my suspicion is, or my hope is that these drugs will be maybe not necessarily even additive, but maybe will replace the need for some of these concomitant medications. So again, I don't look at NASH drug development as something that is strictly focused on the liver disease. And oh, by the way, you need to have a statin and you need to manage their diabetes and you need to get after weight reduction. If we're just throwing out the crystal ball and thinking about the future here, I would love to have a NASH drug that does all the others as well, that manages the patient completely. And I think as our understanding of the pathophysiology of the disease evolves, we'll be able to do that better and better and better. But just circling back to the beginning and what stimulated this conversation, we're in a completely different place than where statins were when they first were crossing through this frontier of approval. But I'd love to hear Michelle and Louise's thoughts as well.
I agree, certainly. One thing that I am concerned about, though, is that the general lack of knowledge or lack of sophisticated knowledge in medicine by even within gastroenterology, or is a disease that affects patients in our subspecialty, if people do not understand how to risk stratify patients within endocrinology, within primary care, certainly within cardiology, a real lack of understanding. And so when a drug becomes available, my concern is that they'll say, oh, now we have a drug for fatty liver. So when I got that ultrasound, now I have, and it said, oh, you have some hepatic steatosis. Now I have a drug I can put you on. And there's going to be people that are going to be seeking these new medications when in fact they really need to be saving them or using them carefully and for the patients that are most at need and most at risk for disease progression. So I do think that's a major problem. Also, similarly, we do have biomarkers, and I think it's great that we do have good evidence now to show that fibrosis as sort of an intermediate endpoint is important, and improvements in fibrosis do link to hard endpoints. But quantifying fibrosis and actually diagnosing fibrosis is challenging. And it's not easy like drawing a lipid panel is and saying your total cholesterol is over 200. It's difficult to interpret these non-invasive tests. You have to use sometimes multiple tests. The cutoffs there may be different considerations depending on the age of the patient, depending on what comorbidities are there. And you may not have access to sophisticated imaging as a primary care doctor or outside of a specialized center. So while these tools are available, and I think that they're, in a lot of ways, I completely agree that we're in a very different place. I am concerned that there needs to be more education about how to use these tools, and they need to be made more readily available and simplified.
Please, why don't you go ahead?
I agree with everything that's been said, and I particularly agree with Michelle in that the context of how they're going to be used. For our NASH population, we're aiming at advanced fibrosis 3 and 4 because of the mortality risk, whereas a lipid panel we can read, it's not difficult to put somebody on a statin and measure the outcomes of that quite quickly, but we're still a long way from defining where we want to treat patients. Do we want to prevent disease at an early stage? And if that was the case, then the treatment of all patients with statins, we would have potentially, I would have thought, seen a regression in the amount of NASH that we're getting and fatty liver disease because we know that they can help, but we don't. It hasn't stopped that. And I think there is that sort of double-edged sword that if you give a pill to sort a problem, people don't change their lifestyle. It's easy, it's solved with a pill. And I think we've discussed that on the podcast before, that if we get a pill for NASH, will that drive further fatty liver disease and ill health, or will it solve more problems? We're in a way better place. We know an awful lot more. We've got genetics, we've got microbiome, we know way more, but we still don't know the particular phenotypes that are affected best. And I do think Michelle's right. Will a GP said we know the low-hanging fruit? They've got diabetes, high cholesterol, hypertension. Let's just stick them on these drugs without doing thorough investigations and targeting lifestyle, everything that can be more beneficial. So yeah, but with caution, I think we have to tread into the future with these.
It's interesting to hear you say that. One of the thoughts I have, and I could be completely off base, is that the fact that payers have greater influence and that has already pushed care in different directions, a lot more focused on guidelines, for example, has the ability even now for us to start to shape how people think about NASH and NAFLD patients differently. So, Louise, the example you gave on your good news, right, about increased screening. But if we educate on all the meanings of the links between NASH and T2D, if we educate that the transition from NAFLD to NASH in a T2D patient has something to do with insulin sensitization, for example, that might, before you ever get a NASH drug, change the drugs that you treat the patient with for the diabetes once you know that NAFLD is present. Now, we haven't cost the healthcare system much money, if any, and we've probably saved it in terms of improving cardiovascular outcomes, even if no one's looked at that specific dimension yet. And by the way, we've risk stratified patients all in one fell swoop, and we've done that without ever talking about a NASH drug. I wonder if there are situations like that. That's one that comes to mind. If there are other situations that we know of now where, without thinking about the drugs we're going to get, but the armamentarium that everyone has to play with today, given the idea that it's demonstrated that non-invasive testing for T2D patients is cost-effective today and the drugs aren't there. So what can we advise about how people think about treatment differently, even in the advance of drugs, that serves to those purposes? Stratify population, demonstrate health benefits and cost benefits, and start to convey a little more about the complexity of the disease and the good tools that we have around diagnosis and stratification and patient identification.
Well, let me just counter that, Roger, because there is some differences between lipids and NASH. Lipids, pretty easy. You get a lipid panel. If it's elevated, everybody knows that there's a certain threshold of LDL. When you look at personal history, you look at their comorbidities, can calculate an ASCVD risk score. There's a threshold for which we accept LDL and lifestyle modification or non-conventional, non-medical therapy. And then when we need to start a statin or even go to, maybe a PCSK9 or combination therapy. The problem that I see with NASH is there's not a perfect test to identify who is at risk for NASH, who has NASH with fibrosis. There's a myriad of blood-based tests, some of which are free, some are proprietary, and then there's quite a few imaging options available. And my guess is there's anywhere from 10 to 20 different algorithms somebody could pick from to begin to stratify. A lot of people want to hang their hat on FIB4 as a screening tool, but remember, that just excludes F3 disease and F4 disease. We all know from the 5 meta-analyses that have been done that F2 or greater is actually where you begin to see increased risk of both liver-related mortality and all-cause mortality. So then tools were developed to look at F2 and greater. Well, that's NIS4, the FAST score, and others. But those require combinations of imaging and blood-based tests or proprietary in nature. So we're trying to work through the simplest possible way to screen, because we've learned from the hepatitis C issue that even if you have a simple blood test to measure an antibody and confirm with a PCR, that providers in general have done a poor job of testing the right patients. That's why we put out all kinds of guidance on if you've had a blood transfusion prior to 1992, you've ever shared clippers, razor blades, toothbrushes, you've been in the service, you've been a healthcare worker, you're a person who uses drugs, even if they're intranasal drugs, to go get tested. If you're HIV, get tested. Those guidances are ubiquitous now. But with fatty liver, even if we say, test every diabetic. Well, the first principle in liver disease is people look at liver enzymes and liver chemistry tests and ALT. Well, heck, we know the more advanced liver disease you have, the more likely ALT is actually going to be completely normal. Your 2 patients you screened, I bet you their ALTs were potentially in the normal range. Maybe not, but we all know that that's common in the setting of cirrhosis. So even if it's not cirrhosis, we know that intermittently liver enzymes can be normal in the NAFLD and NASH population, even with advanced disease. So then we just say, well, get an ultrasound. That doesn't help. So we're down to more advanced imaging modalities. And the ones we have currently available are either relatively cost prohibitive with poor reimbursement, or an MRI is not on every street corner. And even if you have an MRI on every street corner, they're not spun up to the point where they can do PDFF or MR elastography, a multiparametric MRI. We need to understand that it's a bit different than a statin from the sense that, or even Hep C therapy, where we don't have a simple test to diagnose. And so we have to get at this through sequential testing, because we know sequential testing decreases the indeterminate zone. But what's the right sequential test combination? EASL guidance just came out. That's there, but that's, again, relying on potentially FibroScan, which, again, in the U.S., there's a lot of them, but a lot is 1,700. That still leaves large white spaces in the U.S. where that tool isn't readily available. The struggle I have, and the struggle that I think everybody on this podcast has or that listens to it, is how do we deliver a very succinct, clear message to patients, to primary care, endocrine and gastroenterologists, who to screen and how to screen in preparation for that first FDA-approved drug? To me, that's a big difference between statin and NASH therapy.
And just my quick thought on what I heard from Michelle, Louise, and Stephen is we're not going to be treating everybody who has fatty liver on ultrasound. I think this is a very important message, and it's not like in the cholesterol field where everybody jumped on the elevated cholesterol. I think this is an important message. We are working on refining those patients. In the end, it's going to be a very relevant, but most likely smaller subset.
Yeah, and I think if I was personally a payer, I would be looking now. For those that I can remove from that pathway and detect earlier, I can actually remove from the cost of those medications in the future. And therefore, by looking earlier and being more succinct now, we can change the cost profile, because these are not going to be cheap medications and they are going to have to be very targeted, which is one of the reasons all of this great work's going on. What struck me, and we talked about the Spanish study that used FibroScan the other week, and there were lots of limitations and faults with that study. However, what they did do was discuss the cutoffs for CAP, for example, and I think they used 3 cutoffs. They used 250, 220 and 280 for different levels. And I think when I do wellness scanning, I'm sticking very much to the meta-analysis, which is over 2,500 biopsies, but we have yet to fully define what a healthy liver looks like. And a non-healthy liver by FibroScan, what we do is by biopsy on high-risk risk and concentrated patient portfolios, because we're not obviously going to be just biopsying lots of normal livers. The risks are too great. So the school's out on what would be a normal fat content in most people, but we know where we start to get to 280, where it becomes highly indicative of that level of fat on a fibre scan. So is this what we'll find on a biopsy? If we can refine more that sort of period, it would help primary care physicians. It will help diagnostics in the secondary care setting, and people can have a clear level. So maybe going back to starting where we have fat, we know what it is in MRI-PDFF. We know ultrasound is very crude at 30%, but we can start to refine those levels, and in keeping with statin levels and cholesterol and things like that, because people have to remember, and particularly patients, that 80% of our cholesterol production is produced by the body and the liver particularly. So we can't necessarily ingest all of it, but lifestyle is very much part of the current and future management.
I just wanted to circle back to what Stephen was saying earlier, and I completely agree. The real thing that we need right now ahead of a treatment for NASH is we need to have a simple message that can be disseminated to the people who are seeing these patients who are at risk for NASH. These are our endocrinologists, these are primary care, these are our subspecialist cardiologists as well. Because right now I spend most of my clinic seeing patients and kind of going through this at a high level. Someone has incidental hepatic steatosis and they get immediately referred to me. Now, if I saw all of those patients, I would have no time to do anything else. It would be impossible. So this risk stratification really needs to happen before they come in to see the hepatologist. And that is where the real struggle is, because I'm glad when I get patients referred for hepatic steatosis, because most people are just ignoring it completely. So that's a positive, but at the same time, it's impossible. And I'm looking for the small relative proportion that are going to have liver outcomes. And everyone else, we talk about improving metabolic health, but they can get that from all of their other doctors as well. So I think that is really the crux that we as a group need to work on and really partner in a team science way with our colleagues in endocrinology in particular, and also in primary care, to try and disseminate a rational approach to risk stratification for our patients.
First of all, I think these are all great points. And pardon me if I'm oversimplifying, but one of the things I think, Stephen, you've impressed on me repeatedly on the podcast is the idea that primary care is so overloaded with stuff they have to do that time to think or ability to integrate dramatically different patterns just on their part is just going to be a tough thing to make happen. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the principles that we were taught in the military, which I spent 29 years in, was you train and train and train so that when you're in the middle of what we would maybe a PG version would call the crap, you always fall back to your foundational level of training so that you may forget all the nuances, but you fall back to a common denominator, and that's what you rely on. To me, I think that same principle applies to primary care. You have 15 minutes to greet them, treat them, and street them. That's it, 15 minutes. And we all know, Michelle and Jörn and even Louise can sit here and say, we all have the patient. I have a full clinic tomorrow. I go from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock with no break. And if I get behind a little bit, it throws the rest of the day completely off. That's why I quit doing liver biopsies before clinic. Just on the off chance that I have a complication, my whole clinic is shot. But fortunately, that didn't happen, but it could. And we dread the patient that comes in, not the patient, but we dread the one that has the long list of complaints. And you're like, you want to hear every one of them and you want to work through them, but you don't have time to. And the primary care guys are overwhelmed with HEDIS measures and trying to manage blood pressure and hypertension and cholesterol and obesity and aches and pains and arthritis. And then, oh, by the way, we have to get the mammogram. We have to get the colonoscopy. We have to do all the preventative care. Is there really time to talk about fatty liver, particularly when it wasn't taught to them in training? These guys were taught about diabetes. They were taught about nephropathy, neuropathy, but not hepatopathy. They weren't taught that they need to do screening of liver disease. So we have to make it simple so that they fall back to their lowest level of training, their minimal foundational skill set of what to do with fatty liver patients and who these are. And we talk about this all the time, but to me, the low-hanging fruit is a diabetic patient. And maybe we start there and we build this very common theme that if you're a diabetic, 70% chance of having fat, 40% chance of having NASH, 17 to 15% chance of having advanced liver disease. And it's not about the LFTs. We've got to do something additional to look at these people carefully. And I don't have the answers to all of this. Obviously, it's something that a lot of us are working on collectively through our congresses, through patient advocacy groups like GLI and Fatty Liver Foundation and others. Certainly something that Litmus and Nimble and lots of different institutions are looking at. But I don't feel like that we've corporately come together to work as one unit to address this. And that's evident by the multitude of different pathways and algorithms that are out there. And it's too confusing to primary care to know what the right thing to do is in these patients. So then they end up doing what Michelle mentioned. Those that are really concerned, just refer them all, which bogs everything down. And I'm not preaching to the choir here. I am preaching to the choir. You guys know this. If a gastroenterologist sees one of these referrals and says, lose weight and exercise, but oh, by the way, I need to do an upper and lower on you in my ASC because you're over 50, you're white male, you have reflux, and I need to rule out Barrett's. Or, yeah, you're over 50, you need to have a colonoscopy. And then they send the referral back with lose weight and exercise. And oh, by the way, I did the upper and lower and everything looked good. I mean, that's a negative reinforcement factor for the primary care to not send more of those people up the chain. So you can't just educate primary care. We've got to have a continued message to gastroenterologists as well about, look, when these people are referred, do the additional testing. And again, maybe that's a different algorithm once they get to that point, but it is what it is. We just need to keep the message incredibly simple to primary care. And then we have to figure out how to manage that funnel at the tertiary care, secondary care level.
Great question. Do we target somewhere else, though? A patient will often spend more time with their diabetic nurse, for example, than they will do with their primary care physician. They will see their diabetic nurse more frequently than they will see their primary care physician. So maybe spreading the education within the strength of the nursing fields. You can say primary care physicians, you get that rapport with the patient. It is upskilling the diabetes nurses within certainly a section of fatty liver disease, and the same way that we became more knowledgeable about diabetes when we talk about our fatty liver disease with our patients. So they shouldn't be underestimated. There's a great ground force and ability there. And I was struck by something that I think it was on GLI, it was on EASL or one of those, and it was about the strength of women. Women are the predominant people who feed the family, who deal with the family, who look at the diets of the family. They're also the predominant amount of the medical and nursing healthcare workforce throughout the world. So by educating those levels about how to care, that message can be spread in different formats and different ways. But I think maybe targeting elsewhere and also the use of AI just to trigger that this patient's at high risk of fatty liver disease, give as much modern support as we can throughout the specialities may well help our message and keeping it simple. And I love the KISS acronym. Stephen, I use it a lot. But just keeping it simple and using the strength that we've got. It doesn't need to be a primary care physician that holds all of the bread in his basket. It just needs to be shared.
I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. In fact, I would extend that to, we've had this discussion on the podcast as well. I was amazed when I went out and did recruiting at a primary care office about a year ago. The first person that came in was a podiatrist, and she said, well, what are you here for? And I said, well, I want to bring awareness about fatty liver. And she goes, tell me about fatty liver. And I said, well, it's very common in obese, diabetic patients. She goes, diabetics? That's all I see all day long. I see diabetic foot ulcers. I see diabetics with toenail fungus, and I'm trying to prescribe them Lamisil. But before I do that, I get a set of LFTs. They're often abnormal. I don't know what to do. I can't prescribe them Lamisil. I don't know where to send this patient. And this happens all day long. And it just struck a nerve with me that there's a huge part of this healthcare paradigm that we're not targeting. And I think you raise a great point.
In marketing research, there's a study done called a patient journey study, where you take a look at how a patient learns that she or he has a certain disease. Who do they see? What are they treated for? How does that vary based on pathways, concomitant conditions, et cetera? And it seems to me that what the last 2 points speak to is the idea that if we want to hit the patient, then we want to find the points on the patient's journey where they are likely to listen, more likely to be accessible to information, people they trust more, people they know better. And those might well be nurses, podiatrists, dentists are known for that kind of thing in certain specialties. I'm not sure it relates here, but it certainly does for infectious disease, for example. And maybe the question becomes exactly as the two of you suggested, who is it that can convey this message where they have the time to convey it, the patient has the time to hear it, and we can make it simple enough that everybody knows how to take action on it. Is that kind of where you guys going?
Yeah, I think that's perfectly true. But I take it back a step. They don't have to be patients. I know we predominantly talk about patients because they're the very few who got diagnosed and have gone to a pathway. The majority of people with NASH and NAFLD will never be located. So we have to be aiming earlier. And I think once you become a patient and you enter a patient pathway of any description, there is a level of institutionalization. There is a lot of common denominators that we fit round people and that they perform in that role. I think when I do wellness side, people cannot believe how easy it is to look at and assess a liver. And they've never been a patient in their life. And it's this whole different psyche of, well, why wouldn't I do this? They'll just jump on a bed. Whereas if you speak to somebody, I'm not too sure I want to know, you're going to tell me something bad. These are all opportunities to change something that you can alter. And I think there are two different spectrums of mental approach to liver health from the two different sides. The patient who's been a patient at any stage and the journey they expect to be on, and somebody who's never been in healthcare and sees it as purely health and lifestyle and wellness. And they are just two differences. It's like yin and yang sometimes, and you just need a blurring in the middle there to really be more helpful. So I think it's targeting everybody. Everybody should be able to refer in a patient or somebody who they suspect has fatty liver disease, because where does the podiatrist send them? Do they send them back to the primary care physician? Do they send them through a different pathway? I think we haven't sorted out the referral routes that everybody can come through. We all expect it to come through a primary care physician. And in the UK, that has to happen because that's where the money's held. And unless they come through that pathway, the money doesn't follow the person. So I'm not too sure how that would work in the US, for example.
Let me ask this question. This is changing gears and maybe back at Roger. Thinking about statin therapy again and the advent of getting all the statins approved and the indications. What if you had a drug? And again, I'm just thinking resmetirom, given the fact that they've completed their initial enrollment and, we're now just waiting for the results. Let's fast forward this and say they get approved for NASH with F2 or 3 fibrosis. But what if a primary care doc sees a patient with hyperlipidemia and they get a right upper quadrant ultrasound and it shows steatosis? Do you think that they could prescribe resmetirom? It would be off-label. Do you think payers would pay for that? Do you think they would have to prove that there was F2 or 3 fibrosis, or knowing that maybe that medicine could target both the fatty liver and the hyperlipidemia, particularly in a mixed setting where triglycerides are up a little bit and LDL is? Do you think we're going to need to have some assessment of fibrosis severity?
I think that's the biggest challenge facing Madrigal as they approach the launch, because where payers start is we've got good drugs that are cheap to do all these things. So I can do it cheaper than you're talking about. So therefore, it's not a benefit for me that you can do that. Now,
but you got drugs that can treat the cholesterol, but not the fatty liver per se.
The question is whether you think you're treating a system or a set of numbers, right? If you're treating a set of numbers, then I'll just hit every number separately. I'll do something cheap and I'll be done. If I'm treating the system, I have to think about it a little differently. So that puts some pressure on us, going back to kind of where I started, which is to explain why certain patients with fatty liver have risks that aren't simply about reversing fibrosis, and that there are points in the process, or even simply lowering a NASH score, and that there are points in the process where treating that patient is going to have an outcome benefit that will extend well beyond the simple benefit to the liver, that will play out in different ways in different systems around the body. If you can do that, Stephen, then I think you're on different footing. And if you remember part of of my talk in 19 was about how the statin market took off every time they got a new outcome study that proved something more. We need to take an outcomes approach that's not merely about the liver to achieve what you're talking about. And then if we do that, I think, yes, that'll happen. And a publication might actually be enough. Indication might not be necessary.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think about more and more is, we want to get away from a surrogate of a surrogate. We don't want to have a non-invasive compared to a biopsy, which is compared to an outcome. We really just want to take that non-invasive and compare it straight to an outcome. And Michelle and Jörn, Alina, Alan has done a lot of work in that regard with MR elastography, and Perspectum has data with CT1, and now through work that we've done through the Stellar 3 and 4 and simtuzumab program showed that ELF can predict outcomes as well. And I raised this at the single topic conference, the emerging topic conference to the FDA. I said, could we take like a group of people with cirrhosis and just ELF scores greater than 11.3 and then follow them for an outcome? And if we show that our therapy reduced ELF scores and was linked to different outcomes, would that get us where we need to be? And if the answer to that is yes, then every one of the studies we're doing now, where we're doing liver biopsies, paired liver biopsies, we should also have a cohort that's just non-invasively enrolling, because patients would be more inclined to enroll if they have a chance at a non-invasive test only. And we could more rapidly fill the trials, and we could follow them over a longer period of time to get to that outcome. It also means we probably need to enroll patients that are teetering on the edge a little bit more if we want to really prove that point. We can start with the low-hanging fruit, which is, I know we're off topic here, Roger, but I think it's important to drive this point home. We take the MREs that are at the upper crust of where Alina has shown that MREs of 8 correspond to a 40% probability of decompensating at 3 years. And we enroll those people. And, it's a double-blind trial. We follow them prospectively, but you don't have to follow them that long to get 40% of those decompensating. And then once that happens, now we've got that as an endpoint. We can begin to rapidly expand drug development, at least with MRE, but I think you can do that with the other test as well. I bet you could do it with MRI-PDFF. I bet you could show reductions in PDFF and then follow them long enough. And maybe that's what some of the results of the trials we currently are doing are going to show. But I think we need to collectively focus our energies on, beyond the biopsy, as Donna Cryer likes to say, and really getting at comparing a non-invasive test to an outcome.
Stephen, one quick comment and then I want everyone else. But what you just did was kind of the opposite of a digression, because if the reality is that patients can be stratified, then we need to figure out how to stratify them efficiently and figure out how you treat them differently based on how they're stratified. And that's exactly what you just went after. So at the one extreme, right, maybe it's about how do we think about diabetes, but at the other extreme, you're absolutely right. It's where can we bring benefit quickly and prove it simply? All part of the same question. And it was interesting to hear how you started, because within about 30 seconds, I knew that you were going to a place I really thought was consistent with what we were talking about, which is that, right? So stratification isn't just about the biggest target, which is diabetes. It's about the targets that are most desperately in need, people who are compensated cirrhotics, and people that are easiest to identify. And if you can put both of them in the same place, then yeah, that's a great place to start to prove stratification has meaning and some patients should be treated faster.
Following up on Stephen's comment, I think the reason why we start in that pre-cirrhotic, almost cirrhotic, or even cirrhotic in certain areas of the liver population is because they reach endpoints sooner. I still think there's reasoning for also selecting non-cirrhotic patients, but then the problem is we don't reach the endpoint as soon. So for the point now, the population as you've described it, Stephen, potentially high ELF, high MRE, we need that population to show the endpoints. But still, we should then, I think, also look at the others, which will need more time to evolve and reach those endpoints, because those patients are going there too.
No, I totally agree. But if you want to say, if you want to get buy-in on an acceptable endpoint, show it with an endpoint. Show it with something and then build off of that. And the other thing that struck me was in discussions with Frank and Annie at the FDA, who, again, applaud him for really trying to pioneer the way forward here. I didn't realize necessarily that we needed to involve a different agency within the FDA when we start talking about biomarker development and outcomes. And I think we've left out a key component from the discussion. I think it's the CDER. Not 100% sure if I got the acronym right, but that group we need to be bringing in with the Division of Hepatology and other stakeholders to have that discussion about what is it going to take? What do we need to do? What do we need to show? We've got data already. what do we need to do with that data to then advance that forward as an NIT within that context of use?
I think it's CDER, just for what it's worth, although that's what it used to be. It could have changed.
Just to follow up on that statement as well from Jörn and Stephen, I completely agree. I think the other thing is, practically speaking, we're not going to be risk stratifying our patients clinically with biopsy on a large scale. Like, we don't even have to get into the reason why we're not going to, because it's so obviously not the right choice. And there's enough problems with it already as a surrogate endpoint. And so I think we have a lot of choices. We have a lot of good data already. And I completely agree that getting beyond the biopsy, looking at other non-invasive tests that are also sort of practically more accessible to patients and providers makes a lot of sense.
An hour in, it starts to become a good time to wrap up. I laid this topic out to start a discussion about what are the different creative ways we can think about stratifying our population and diagnosing and treating them that could start to demonstrate that this is not a single ubiquitous disease with a single population that's a quarter or a third of all Americans. And I think we've covered a bunch of space in that territory today, which is great. On close, let me ask each of you, and here Brave One Goes First means you get the low-lying fruit, to pick one point either that's been in this conversation or that's been in the back of your head during this conversation that's an action step we should be taking now, we can be taking now, or we can drive people to take now to make that argument more forcefully.
I'm going to take it another jab here. My first thought was, when Stephen mentioned the pathologists, I thought I hadn't enrolled a single patient with a diabetic foot ulcer in any of the studies, and I've been doing some for quite a while. We're still not seeing all the populations, and that's mainly based because of we have to select based on inclusion, exclusion on trials. And there might be a variety of patients that are underserved or underrecognized, and maybe some flexibility. It's important to get the approved drugs and the agreed endpoints and the inclusion, exclusion right. Really, the refinement of the study population is something, and we might even be leaving out some patients with relevant disease at this point.
We had a lot of discussion about non-invasive testing, and I think that's great. And definitely creating the message, a simple message to our colleagues in medicine about how non-invasive testing can be used is important. But I also think something that maybe we haven't discussed yet is that we still need more granularity and kind of nuance in how to use these non-invasive testing, especially in certain populations. So certainly in pediatric, younger age patients, we are not there yet with fully understanding what cut points we need to use for the most accessible non-invasive testing like FIB4, and also for those at the other extreme of age as well, the older age patients. And then for our select populations, persons with diabetes as well, which is the best test to use. So I would say our next step as a liver disease community is really to focus in and try and fully understand what is the best pathway moving forward, how to use these non-invasive testing most effectively, and to think about these certain subgroups as well that haven't really been a focus up until now.
Yeah, and I'll just foot stomp that and say maybe our initial focus as a society or as an interested group of individuals focused on fatty liver is use these tests for their negative predictive value and excluding those people that we don't need to worry about. And then those that fall in the indeterminate range or the positive range, that's a funnel that I think our GI docs can handle. 20% of the population with fatty liver probably deserves additional workup. So we create a different set of criteria for the gastroenterologist where we really get a little more sophisticated with sequential testing. We just keep it really simple. Tell me who I don't need to worry about. That's the 80% solution. If we could just do that, the rest of them, we can work through different algorithms. Maybe Kaiser has a different algorithm that works better for them, and Blue Cross Blue Shield has one that works better for them. I don't know. We'll just have to sort out what that is. But I think instead of trying to do one size fits all for primary care, GI, hepatologists, let's go after where they're better suited. And primary care to me is better suited for excluding disease.
Just going to agree with Jörn, Michelle and Stephen there, and basically keeping it simple. We've got some very good tools. We just need to refine them. But maybe we also need to just say, in most disease areas, just rule the liver out. Give it at least a thought, because you don't want it to come back and bite you in the end, and you could have actually found it earlier, because that's very expensive. It's timely. So maybe just keeping it as simple as rule it out of your condition. And if it's a tool involved, whether it's it's polycystic ovary disease, whether it's any of those related conditions, just rule it out, because then you can move on to the more finite. So yeah, keeping it really simple, just to help everybody could get the right people through the door.
And all that makes sense to me. Maybe I'm just obtuse. I'm not certain how it addresses the question I started with, which is about how we explain that it's not such a large number of people all at once being treated the same way indiscriminately. I think you can build that within the context to keep it simple, but if that's part of the goal, you have to be careful. Stephen, I agree with you. I think that if you can rule out a lot of the population real quickly, that helps it boil it down to, okay, who do we want to think about in which ways? But if we don't keep an eye on that, we are going to run the risk that people who don't really understand what we're trying to do or what liver disease is about and all the ways that it influences, and I think everything you're saying is right, we need to stay thoughtful about the idea that goes, there are subpopulations that can be treated faster and should be treated faster. And that in of itself proves the case that goes, this isn't what people are afraid of in the first place. 25% of the American population all getting a drug on day one because primary care doesn't know what to do. I like Stephen's idea about having them screen out. At that point, we're not worrying about them giving a drug. And then from there, we educate about the different pathways you can go and the different things you can do. That sounds like a path forward to me, at least the beginnings of one. Other comments and thoughts? With that, let me thank everybody for joining. Stephen, Louise, Jörn, Michelle. This all came together pretty quickly, and thank you for that. I will be back probably not in 15 minutes, probably in about a week and a half with the business section for all this. And I promise when the business section comes back, I will try to share with you Louise's recorded reaction to Euro 2020, particularly if the English are capable of winning it.
I'll do one specially for you.
Okay, it's a deal. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy. I'll see you all in 2 weeks. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Something really exciting to celebrate, a surfing NASH milestone.
Hi, this is Roger. Welcome to the back end of today's podcast. Like I said, fantastic topic, and I think some really great energy. First things first, we have a celebration. End of last week, we went over 20,000 downloads since we joined Buzzsprout about a year ago. That's a big number. It's the last number where Buzzsprout sends you congratulations. After 20,000, they figure either you're for real or you're just going to drop off. We're for real. So that's very exciting, and I want to thank all of you who've downloaded and listened and joined us.
News on podcast scheduling and live audience participation.
Number 2, about our future. 2 things will be different in our future that are worth knowing about. Number 1, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be going to a 9-day audience drop so that we have time after the episode to do a better job of editing and producing and don't run into the problem we ran into with not getting an episode out last week. I'll talk about that right after this. Second, those of you who listened during EASL know that we ran an experiment with live audience. We are going to expand that dramatically. The feedback from people in the audience has been fantastic, and we even had one gentleman come on and ask us a question. We'll be providing information on the website and on LinkedIn on how to get yourself invited to the live audiences and when they are coming up in the future. But generally, the rule is if we've got your address, we will send you an invitation because we can have up to 1,000 people in the audience, and we don't usually have 1,000 listeners for an episode. So that's a good thing.
In podcasting, things go wrong all the time, but you usually don't see it. Last week, you did. Sorry for not posting the episode.
I've mentioned before that at the end of conferences, we're frequently exhausted. And frankly, EASL was very, very draining. If you go over to Europe for a meeting and you're an American, then you get on European time zone. That's not bad. But we were starting at 2 and 3 in the morning and going through until 5 in the afternoon and then having dinner with our families, etc. And frankly, by the end of the conference, we were all pretty wiped out. The next weekend was the 4th of July. And I was going on vacation on July 7th. Net result, we did not have time to create an episode before I was scheduled to leave. And we were too exhausted to put anything together out of the existing materials. So now we're back. Next week, we'll have Donna and her folks, and then we'll be on the 9-day schedule. Keep an eye out for news about how to get a live audience ticket, and we look forward to seeing you with us to listen live, ask questions, share jokes, and improve the quality of our podcasts every week. And with that, I want to thank everybody who made this happen, all our fantastic guests today. Magic Mike Wilson, who figured out how to get Donna's podcast into some kind of shape, which you'll hear next week, and who put all the pieces together on this one virtually on 24 hours notice at the end. I want to thank Eric Rounds for social media, for everything he does, and most of all you, all our listeners who make this so worth doing. I want to thank the people particularly who sent notes and comments about EASL, and those several of you who told us we got to keep the live audience feature. We're listening. We're going to do it. Take care. Stay safe. Surf on. See you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
You've been listening to the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast. Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website. Thanks for listening. See you next week on the podcast.